So, hello, everybody. We're here with Samantha Seipel. She very generously came and spoke about Louisa on the Front Lines, a book published last year, and she spoke to our museum recently. Hopefully, we could convince her to come back in the future, but I'd like to welcome her and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So, you mentioned in an email to me that the story of Louisa May Alcott has a lot of parallels to current events in our hospitals. Could you give us an example and maybe speak a bit
Sure.
about the lessons her life can give us today in a broad sense?
Sure. So back in Louisa's time during the Civil War, the hospitals were overwhelmed with so many wounded, similar today with the COVID-19, where they're overwhelmed. And back in her time, though, women weren't allowed to be nurses. So they had a shortage because only men were allowed to nurse. However, usually it was like a wounded soldier who, um, was getting better, but maybe, still weak, um, and couldn't get back into the battle. So anyway, um, because of the Battle of Bull Run and with all of the injuries, they decided to let women become nurses. And that was just like they're talking about today with COVID-19, going to the front lines, where when you worked in the hospital, it wasn't just the injury, it was all of the diseases, and they didn't know really about germ theory back then, so they didn't even know to wear a mask. And people ended up dying from disease. They didn't have medicine like they do today. They didn't have the antibiotics. And Louisa herself got typhoid pneumonia, and they didn't know how to treat it. And they ended up giving her calomel, which is poison. It's mercury, and it actually ended up nearly killing her. And it actually, they believe, triggered today, modern medicine, they believe, triggered lupus in her. So she was actually very sick through the rest of her life. So it's interesting how the just the overwhelming number of patients not being able to treat it with any kind of medicine, and people just getting sick and dying and being on the front lines. And it's very similar and runs parallel to what we've experienced with the pandemic and COVID-19.
It must have been extremely dangerous to be a nurse like Louisa May Alcott was at that time, like you said. Do you know about the statistics about how dangerous it was?
I don't have the statistics, but I do know that in society, it was it was not proper for a woman to actually be a nurse. So there was also that, where the men and the women weren't used to working together, and so there was trouble with just taking orders, being treated like, you're in the military. They didn't really understand that. With the women, they were only supposed to be there to act like the substitute mother. Um, and the women weren't paid as much as the male nurses. And interestingly enough, like Walt Whitman, he was well known for being a nurse at that time too. So he had his experience, and it really impacted him as well. With his brother actually was injured in the war, sick, and he went to care for him. So the idea of a hospital during that time too, not many people actually went to the hospital. When you got sick, your family cared for you. Um, People didn't go to the hospital like to have babies, or if anything happened. So that was a new idea as well. And also how to treat the patients when you have so many injured people coming in. Who do you care for first? And it's the triage of who is going to make it, who has the best chance of making it. They get treated first, as opposed to someone who wasn't going to make it. So that actually was something that was organized and developed during the Civil War. And we're seeing that too with the COVID-19 and, who do you treat? And when you don't have enough um, ventilators, who gets the ventilator? So,
Right. And in a lot of ways, it seems like the recent shutdown, the lockdown that we've imposed in order to help stop the spread of this virus, was sort of everyday life back in those times. I was
yeah.
watching the HBO special John Adams, for example. Of course, it's
Mm-hmm.
about 100 years before the Civil War, but
Mm-hmm.
um, they
It shows the
depicted,
pattern. Yeah.
right, everybody going into lockdown because a wave of the yellow fever was coming. So it seems like
Yes.
it's
And that people, life was very precarious where even in Louisa's life, her sister got sick and died, and her mother was very ill, and she herself then became very ill. And you lived with that, um, where you weren't sure, how to treat anything, if you were going to make it, and so it is interesting. And when you mentioned the like the Revolutionary War, it was during that time that they realized that when the hospitals were in the open air in tents, that the fresh air, that those soldiers fared better than those that were enclosed, germ infested, not well ventilated rooms where they didn't know that the germs were spreading, but they knew that if you had fresh air, that you had a better chance of surviving. And that was something that Florence Nightingale, during the Civil War time, she put in her nursing manual of what nursing is and is not. And that was one thing that Louisa herself always wanted the windows to be open, even if the soldiers were shivering because of the germs. And, well, she didn't know they were the germs, but knew that that ventilation was good for everybody.
Mhm. Now, we've hosted Louisa on the front lines at the museum, but you have an impressively large body of work. Can you tell us a bit about what themes you follow in your writing overall and why you chose the subjects to cover that you did?
Sure. One of the connections between all or among all of the books is that I always like to find things that the history maybe is forgotten now, overlooked. Maybe it was something really big, like with Bird and Igloo, the flying over the North and South Pole. That was huge during its day, and he was a huge celebrated explorer, but we don't really know about that anymore. And that's an inspiring story and something that people still connect with when you have big feats. Um, and it's the same with like Teddy Roosevelt, huge feat of mapping the River of Doubt. That story hadn't been told for the young adult audience, and it's very well documented. He kept and wrote a book himself on what happened during that. Um, and his son had kept a journal while he was on the trip with him. So it's interesting to go back, especially when time has passed, to look and see what they've accomplished, to see things in a different way. Like with Teddy Roosevelt, you see him in a different perspective. And also too, with like Lincoln's Spy Master, they don't really talk about in school about how Lincoln was almost assassinated the first time. And so then you bring in Pinkerton, and a lot of people don't really know about Pinkerton in the way that he was so famous and celebrated during his time. Now they might just equate it with security or strikes in more modern times. So that's the one connection theme, I guess, that goes throughout all of my work, is I like to investigate forgotten pieces of history or history that's been pushed aside or overlooked.
Yeah, you seem to have a lot of books on relatively unknown, at least events that are relatively unknown in popular
Hmm.
culture. A couple that caught my eye as well were a few incidents in the Second World War where America was under attack itself.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could tell us what sort of valuable lessons could we learn from studying these incidents today?
Yeah, it's fascinating how, um, especially I get letters from kids who read the books, and how much they enjoy knowing something that maybe their parents or their teachers don't know. And that's part of the reason is for national security, where they really, and also I guess propaganda to keep morale up, that during this time, sure, there might be some newspaper articles about it, but then it's swept aside or presented in a way that, um, maybe makes us look good so that morale stays high. um, so I always find those topics really interesting because the classified documents then are declassified. And with the Nazi saboteurs, um, MI5 has a file on what happened in America when the Nazis landed and came here. And that file is right on the internet, free for anybody to look at. To me, that was so exciting to find and to get a different perspective, not from America's perspective, but from Britain's perspective of how they viewed, because they were being attacked all the time. And they were surprised that we weren't vigilant. If we had any idea that the U-boats were out there attacking, um, but as in like the opening of the book, you have the soldier walking along the shore and he just has a flashlight because he's figuring that it's not going to happen, and it does. And they're unprepared and they get away, and they wouldn't have caught them if one of them didn't betray them. And then to be able to read all of the court transcripts that are now unclassified, they're declassified, they're on the internet. You can go and you can read them, and how that trial connects to how we treat terrorists today and how that impacts us today. And so it's fascinating how something that seems so long ago and seems hidden from the public view is right there. If you know where to look, if you know the key words, um, you can find it and you can learn from that, and you can see how it's shaped us as a country.
Mhm. How would you say it's shaped us as a country?
Well, it has definitely shaped how we treat terrorists. And um, I also think that it's interesting, like with the Ghosts in the Fog, with the attack on um, the Aleutians, and how that they were invaded by the Japanese, and how one of my neighbors who was actually in the Navy, who he had been to the Aleutians, he said he never knew that they had actually been invaded. Yes, he knew that they had been attacked, but they never mentioned it when he was there, that they had been invaded. So I find that fascinating, that it's sort of the propaganda and the how you want to shape the history, um, with what you want to tell the American people. Um, and you see that with just how history is shaped by the information that we receive through whatever channels. And they chose not to um, really present this to the American people, like the Aleutian War, even with the own military, um, just making it classified and saying, no, we got attacked, but hey, we're fine. So it's fascinating how then you get into the classified information and you can see where, yes, they were actually battling and they were there and they were staying. They weren't going anywhere.
Mhm. I wonder if I could ask you a sort of broad historical question. In the course of your research for these two books about the Second World War, what do you think Germany and Japan's goals with the United States were, at least militarily? It seems to me that it would probably be very impractical from Germany's point of view to physically subdue the United States. What were they hoping to accomplish?
Right. I think they were both hoping to demoralize the United States, to show them that they had reach and power. And with the Nazi saboteurs that came in, it was to attack our infrastructure. And so factories that were doing production for war. And so that's interesting with today too, because now it's, cyber attacks, and there are ways of having a long reach, um, where you don't even have to mobilize and get in that U-boat and show up on shore. So
Mhm.
I do think that it was to show their power and their reach and to make Americans panic and fearful.
Mhm.
And they also talked too about in the World War II, there were, you know, um, the fifth column is what they talked about, where they had, where they hoped to basically have people rise up and turn against the United States. So it's fascinating to to see, and you see similar things today that maybe we don't focus on, but we might pass off as conspiracy theories, or and you're never quite sure.
Mhm. I've been asking a lot of authors how they get their sources, how they go about the research for their work, and a similar theme I've been hearing is that there's actually quite a lot of what I've been calling door knocking,
Hmm.
where you're talking to people who may have had a personal connection to the history you're trying to research. Do you do a lot of that? Or are there methods that
So
you use?
with Ghosts in the Fog, I was fortunate that people were still alive that had actually been in the Aleutian War. And so, and it's helpful, like on the internet, you can track down people, which is great. And for that book, I was able to track down one of the weathermen who had been captured by the Japanese and was a prisoner of war, and also family members who, had information about their fathers who had been in the Aleutian War. So it's always exciting when you can make that contact and get the insider's view, or even just to confirm information that you already have on them. Another thing is primary sources. I was able in the Ghosts in the Fog to track down um, interviews that another weatherman gave to the Naval College, and that hadn't been published or seen. So when you can get those primary sources, or I like to go to like the Library of Congress, and I was able for the Death on the River of Doubt, Kermit Roosevelt's diary. They just handed it to me, and you're able to look at it and read it, and it feels like you're touching the hand of the person who was actually there. So it's always exciting to get confirmation. And I also really love that a lot of classified information too, they make available to the public when it's been declassified. You know, they make it accessible and easy to get to. And so then when you read the court transcripts for Nazi saboteurs, it's fascinating to just see what they had to say and how they defended themselves and the stories that they had to tell. And so that's how, yeah, I do a lot really online. It makes it really easy. It's amazing that the historical societies tracking down letters is always, especially if they've been unpublished, it's always very exciting to see what they have to say and to try to make those connections of, you know, what hasn't been revealed before, or if it confirms something that you believe to be the truth.
I'm always surprised. I got a degree in history, and so when I would do research in a historical archive in a library, and you would pull some old document or something from the back, I was always surprised by the fact that they just let me touch it, you know, without
I
gloves and
know.
things of that nature.
It's so exciting. I know. I'm
Yeah,
like, shouldn't I be wearing gloves? But
right,
no,
right.
you know, I guess there's like, it's not supposed to be, it's supposed to be bad or something now that you wear gloves. So it's like, wow,
Oh, it's
it's so,
supposed to be bad. Why do the gloves leave a residue?
I don't know, but that's just what I've heard. I don't know. I haven't confirmed that, but yeah, it's just what I've heard. But it is so amazing that, yeah, I like to just geek out over that. It's so amazing.
Right.
And with the Pinkerton, apparently, you know, they still have, because it's through the detective agency, they kept, well, some of it got burned and lost, but then, you know, they have other things. Well, and also with the Nazi saboteurs, apparently they still have like the handkerchief that has the invisible ink note on it, you know, that you can see. And it's just amazing, you know, some of the stuff that has been kept and preserved.
Hmm. Now, it seems like a lot of the books you've written, at least a good number of them, have focused on espionage or the history of incidents surrounding espionage. And
Mm-hmm.
I recently was talking to Gary Powers Jr., who his father was Gary Powers, who was shot down over the Soviet Union in the U-2 incident in 1960. And he's big into historical espionage. He works with some museums, and I asked him this question, and I wondered, I'd like to hear your answer to it as well. Why is the history of espionage specifically important to preserve for future generations? What are the lessons that you're hoping to take from that particular point in history?
Um, that's a good question. I think that, let me think about that. So the lessons, I guess it's, for me, it's how people can be so resourceful and outwitting the bad guys, especially when you're in the World War II and even the Civil War, when so much is at stake. And um, I guess there's some sort of satisfaction, I think, when you see somebody outsmart the bad guy. And like in World War II, it was pretty clear like who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. And even now, looking back on the Civil War, I mean, I think for me anyway, it's very clear which side, you know, I'm on Louisa's side, you know, for rights for everybody. And so I think it is, for me, there's that satisfaction where you're outsmarting the bad guy, but you have to be resourceful and sort of MacGyverish in your thinking and what you're going to do. And there's something very thrilling and exciting about that, to see the underdog or the good guy overcome, you know, there's that super power, or even like the Superman element to that, like, hey, you know, I'm going to get out sword here and and overtake and change the world, and the good guys win.
Hmm.
And I think it's taking a stand. There's something inspiring about that when people really take a stand for what they believe in, and when it's for the good, and to see them succeed. And espionage, there's something very, you know, interesting and exciting about that,
Hmm.
because the bad guy doesn't see it coming.
Right. I wondered if we could talk a bit about your writing style as well. Nazi Saboteurs is advertised, at least at a lot of uh, on a lot of websites that sell the book, as being for young readers. And I was wondering,
Mhm.
do you modify your writing for books that are meant for young readers as opposed to older readers?
um, I I think for me the only difference, I don't really modify my style. Um, I always try to make it so that it's readable. I want it to read more like a novel, so that people don't feel that it's textbookish. But I think the main difference between writing for the younger, the young adult versus adult, is that the adult book is longer. You may go into it a little more, um, where with the kids, you're competing with the video games, the movies, and all of that. So you want to keep it a little more fast paced and moving along. But I try to still make it fast paced and moving along for the adults as well, but it just might go into more detail.
Mhm. I've always wondered. I've never written a book, so I've never had the experience of sitting down and trying to write an entire book before. How does one do that? I mean, do you have to do you write when it comes naturally? Do you have to sort of sometimes force yourself? I mean, I've
Yeah,
never
you do
encountered
have to
this.
force yourself sometimes. Yeah.
Okay.
But what I think, the beginning, like the seed of it, is a story that you find interesting. Like, oh, that's cool. I want to learn more about that, or something that sparks you and gets excited. Um, so it'll carry you through. Um, but for me, in order to do a narrative so that it reads more like fiction, I like to use screenwriters' structure. So, like, one of the biggest secrets out there is Save the Cat book. Um, it talks about all the different genres. It talks about all of the different plot points. You can apply that structure to really good um, nonfiction stories as well. So when you are able to still keep it true but follow that structure, that's the bones of your story. And that's what keeps the pages turning. And that's a big, like, it really can help you outline and lay everything out
Hmm.
so that you know where you're going with the story. And also research. Like, the more that all the little details that you can figure out, like what was the weather that day, things like that, that you can fill in, that add to the story and to the texture and to just the setting, and all the little things that you can find out about the people, even like what are the color of their eyes and all that stuff that um, you would find in a novel that maybe they make up. But if you can find that factual stuff and add it in, weave it in, and then follow a certain structure that screenwriters and storytellers use, that's really the secret sauce.
Hmm. Do you how do you schedule the writing of a book? Because I'm just picturing if I were to write an essay, for example,
Yeah.
sit down at 3 o'clock and I got to get
Yeah.
X number of pages done.
Right.
That's sort of what I mean by
Yeah.
force yourself. Not, I'm sure it's a very interesting
Right.
process in general, but does one have to schedule it?
So I always try to do it first thing in the morning. So it's like whatever, it's even like if you have to exercise, stuff that you know is good for you, but maybe you aren't excited about actually starting. But once you get going, you're okay. And so I find that if you just start first thing, um, that then you're off to a good start and you can keep going.
Mhm.
So I usually try to do it right when I wake up before I can start telling myself stories that, oh, I've got to do this or I've got to do that or I don't have time for this or, so it seems best before then anything else
Right.
gets in the way.
Do you have any projects you're currently working on? Anything we can look forward to in the future?
I am working on something. I'm not really ready to like talk about what it is, but it's another um, exciting story that takes place during World War II that helped change the course of the war. And I'm still in the early stages of trying to see how it's panning out and if it's going to work and all of that. But yeah, it's been fun.
I was looking at Mutants, Clones, and Killer Corn. That one jumped
Yes.
out at me.
Okay.
Can you give those of us who've yet to read that book an example or two of some of the
Yes.
genetic creations we can look forward to reading about?
Yes. Well, that book, my husband helped me write that book, and he actually was in the biotechnology field, and so he helped me come up with that idea. And one of the strangest, I thought, was they um, grew an ear on the back of a mouse, and it had to do with a human ear on the mouse's back, and it had to do with trying to grow body parts. It's why they're doing something like that, or that, and like on the cover of the book, you'll see that a rabbit that is glowing fluorescent green, where they were able to take the gene from a jellyfish and insert it into the rabbit so that he glowed green like a jellyfish. I thought, wow, that is strange but interesting.
Does the book purely focus on the history of genetic engineering, or does it talk about the future as well?
It talks about um, the history, how it sort of starts way, 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 way back, and then it talks about the future. But the book came out many years ago, like in 2005. So the future is here. Here we are. So
Right.
we're cloning things. They're
So,
they're already cloning pets, right?
right.
Taking the like if your pet dies and then they bring it back with
Mhm.
the genes that they saved.
So, was writing something you always knew you wanted to do? How did you discover that you were a writer, and how did that develop?
It wasn't something that I knew as a kid. It wasn't until I went to college, and I was undecided. I always liked to read. Um, I was a huge fan of Laura Ingalls growing up, and so I liked history, historical fiction, and history. But it wasn't until my freshman year when you take classes and you can take creative writing, you could take journalism, and so that struck my interest. And then I combined the two. And then it just came about. I didn't really know about the researching until I actually went to library school. And that was during the time when the internet was just starting to become mainstream, and learned how to do research on the internet. And so that was really helpful in databases and things like that. So it was more of a, I think, a process of over time noticing interests and combining what I'd learned and thinking, oh, this is where I want to go.
I've heard people who would like to be a writer in the future ask authors, what can I do to improve my writing? How can I become a better writer? And oftentimes I hear them say, just write. You know,
Yeah.
just sit down and write about anything. Volume helps. Is that advice you would offer somebody?
I think so, but I also think that there are certain areas, like for me, it was not until I really learned about structure, story structure, that really helped reveal how stories are crafted. So once you have a better idea of how to craft it so that you know what piece of the story goes where. You see that all the time too. It's much easier to see in movies, but so for me, story structure, and then also I think character development, and there. But basically, the storytelling techniques, I think, is one of the things that you need to study along with your writing, so that your writing is going somewhere and improving,
Mhm.
so that it's not just a lot of words where the story doesn't really go anywhere. You need goals, you need conflict, dialogue, all that kind of stuff, which I think if you study the craft of it is very helpful along with writing.
Mhm. You have a very broad subject base. You know, it must take a lot of skill to be able to cover the amount of subject matter that you have with the
So that's
success
where,
that you
like,
have.
well, that's where I guess research, if you, and also like if the story interests you and you have a spark of interest, so then the research, to me, is fun, because that is like tracking down and trying to find out things. And you know, there's, I like to read, there's the reading involved. So what I learned basically in library school, which has served me through my writing career, is that if you know the key words, you know, with what you're going to research, then you can learn and teach yourself anything. And if you know who to ask and what to ask, and that would be like the journalism coming in, then you can figure stuff out. And then if you know the craft of storytelling, you can lay it all out so that people can read it and enjoy it.
Mhm. Well, that covers the questions I had prepared. Thank you
Great.
for your time. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you doing this with us.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you for having me.